Hello my friends, welcome to my channel, Lindy's Magpie Reads. If you're new here, I'm Lindy, a special welcome to you. I like to talk about books, so if that's what you like too, please stick around. I read a lot, pretty much a book a day, and I have 7 books to tell you about that I've read in the past week. But first, I'll fill you in a little bit on what's been going on. We are still getting our house ready for a new owner and packing up, which includes selling a lot of art that my sweetie has made. So we've had 2 art sales in the past week. Of course, there was cake. When company's coming, you gotta make cake. In this case, though, I made cupcakes to make it easier for drop-in guests to just pick up something and eat it. For the first art sale, I made the very same cake that I made last week that I talked about, the sunken plum and apricot cake, because it looks so impressive, except I did it in cupcake version. I didn't take a photo of that, but for the next art sale, I made a yellow cake, or yellowest yellow cake, with saskatoons from the garden and raspberries from my garden, both of which I had frozen in the freezer, and I do have a picture of that. So while I was going through all the cleaning up and sorting and what's going to go with me and what's not, I came across this 2-volume set, a monograph from Library and Archives Canada that has an article that I co-wrote with a colleague, Wendy Gronestad de Moore, based on a talk that we gave at a couple of different library conferences. It was called No Ephebephobia Here, and I'll read you the opening paragraph. Ephebephobia is an abnormal and persistent fear of teenagers. People who work in public libraries are as susceptible to ephebephobia as anyone else. Not many of us have an extreme fear, but it is common to experience some discomfort around certain teens. Teens enjoy being surrounded by their peers. Call this group a pack, and they already seem scarier. So, in English and in French, a whole bunch of different contributors to this anthology about innovation in Canadian libraries. I don't need to keep this. Now that I've told you about it, it's going to find a new home. So now we are on to those 7 books that I mentioned, finishing in the past week. 3 of them are by Canadian authors. 5 of them are graphic novels. This gives you a clue to my reading personality. When I'm stressed, I can relax with a good graphic novel. 2 of the 7 books are by queer creators, and 3.5 are nonfiction. You'll find out about the half when I get to that title. Book number 1 is called Size: How It Explains the World, and it's by Vaclav Smil, a Canadian professor of environmental studies in Manitoba. The book is full of fascinating trivia. There's probably too many numbers for my taste. I say probably because I felt like when there was a lot of numbers in the audiobook, I was having trouble paying attention. I think it might have been better if I wasn't distracted by all the other things going on in my life, or if I'd been reading it in print, but all of the trivia stuff really did capture my interest. So, for example, he talks about large and small, and how miniatures can impress and entertain us, but they don't inspire awe in the same way that large things do. Smil writes that large has always been a byword for importance and grandeur in the human imagination. And all 7 wonders of the ancient world made their list due to their unusually large size. Some of the other things that he writes about are the advantages of being tall. He writes about scaling and symmetry and asymmetry, ergonomics and airline seats. There's a really interesting section on how normal became normal and about the golden ratio. And the question is this something ubiquitous, or is it actually imaginary? My favorite chapter was actually the final one. It's not really a conclusion for all the stuff that's in the book, but he does sort of summarize all the many things that he pointed out in it. And I like that last bit so much that I listened to it 3 times. And the other audiobook that I listened to is a novel by Heather Fawcett called Emily Wilde's Encyclopaedia of Faeries. So it is historical romance, historical fantasy set in late 19th century or early 20th century alternate universe, because there are fairies, and our central character, Emily Wilde, is a researcher and academic who studies fairies. So she's a dryadologist. It's told in quite a whimsical way. The pace is slow. It took me a long time to get into it, partly because I could tell that there was a romance trope that was a major part of it. Emily is kind of antisocial. She's written as if she's a neurodivergent character, although that's not used anywhere in it. But she has a colleague, a male colleague, who she finds insufferable. And it's pretty quickly apparent that he's interested in her. The format of the writing is that this is Emily Wilde's journal, her personal journal. There are many things about this book that reminded me of another series. This book, by the way, Emily Wilde's Encyclopaedia of Faeries, is book 1, so I assume there's more coming out. But the series that it reminds me of is the Dragonology series by Marie Brennan. I only read the first book in that series, and I probably liked both books about the same, sort of a 3.75 to 4-star kind of rating. And I was a little disappointed because the other book that I read by Heather Fawcett is a collection of short stories called The Swan Suit, and I loved them. And that book is also fantasy. And Heather Fawcett is a Canadian writer who lives in Ontario. Next up are 5 graphic novels, starting with a queer Canadian one, When I Arrived at the Castle. It's by Emily Carroll. If you've liked her previous work, such as Through the Woods, which is a collection of short fantasy horror, then I think you will like this too. This is lesbian vampire-ish. One of the main characters is an anthropomorphic cat, and the story is unsettling and haunting and very clever. It alludes to many folk tales, especially French ones like Melusine and the White Cat and Donkey Skin, Bluebeard. There's a bit of Japanese folklore feel to it. It's about monsters within. There are surprises. The mystery and tension and scariness is incorporated with the page turns. So I am not going to flip through it to show you, maybe just the two opening pages. When I arrived at the castle, she said, "You're early. Please make yourself comfortable." There's the Catwoman. I'm a fan of everything I've ever read by Emily Carroll. If you're into body horror, fantasy, feminist, lesbian stuff, give this a go. The next book I'm going to tell you about is by two Spanish creators, because I am on Team Spain in the Women's World Cup BookTube Readathon. There'll be information linked down below if you want more information about that. Spain is going to be in the final game against England on Sunday. So we shall see. If England wins, then the next thing for me to do is read something by a British writer. Now, last week I asked you to recommend short books by Spanish creators, preferably by women. And thank you very much to Alina and Erin and Oliva, who sent me some great recommendations, and I have made note of them for reading later. But for easy access, I was able to check out from my library's Hoopla collection this graphic novel from a series that I've read already, and this is the new one that just won an Eisner Award this year. Best U.S. edition of international material. More information about the Eisner Comic Book Awards will be down below. The series is Blacksad, and the newest volume is They All Fall Down, Part 1. The creators are Juan Díaz Canales and Juanjo Guarnido, and it's translated by a Canadian comic book editor, Diana Schutz. Now, the original Blacksad is written in Spanish but translated to French for its original publication, because it's a French publisher that's been putting out this series. So Diana Schutz, who is multilingual, used both the French edition and Juan Díaz Canales' Spanish text to make this translation. It makes sense to start from the beginning with the very first Blacksad book instead of jumping in here. I mean, you could, but because of character development, I think you'd appreciate it more. It's anthropomorphic depiction in a alternate history U.S. about 1950s. It's very noir, and John Blacksad is a private investigator. It's pretty much all you need to know. The artwork is breathtaking. Watercolors, you can see the texture of the paper. Here's the image from the back cover with the Weasel Mafia. I particularly like this page because Guarnido, the artist, is referencing a very famous Dennis Hopper painting, Nighthawks. The art just keeps getting better and better in this series. Next up is another graphic novel, also a historic piece set in, I think, 1940s, 1950s, something like that. It's called Flung Out of Space, inspired by the indecent adventures of Patricia Highsmith. It's by Grace Ellis and Hannah Templer. As the title suggests, inspired by the life of Patricia Highsmith. So it's not really a biography. So this is the one that I call a half nonfiction. The award that it got at the Eisners this year is Best Reality-Based Work. The note at the beginning of the book talks about Patricia Highsmith and how she was deeply anti-Semitic, racist, and misogynistic, even by the standards of her time. They show her through the story as being not a nice person, but also very charismatic. She worked as a comic book writer, hated doing it because she wanted to work on her own stories, her real literary stories. And through the course of this graphic novel, we see her working on her first published work, Strangers on a Train, and also how the book, The Price of Salt, which is later known as Carroll, came to be. The Price of Salt is famous as pretty much the first lesbian novel with a happy ending. I think this book is an outstanding example of using comics to tell stories. So here's an example where Pat is seen typing away at her computer, but most of the page is showing what's in her mind, the train. You can see a little bit on the typewriter. Who'd you ever feel like murdering, like killing a hot little rat? Only she, perhaps lines from the book Stranger on a Train. The title of this book, by the way, Flung Out of Space, I'm pretty sure that comes from The Price of Salt. I think that's a line in that novel. And here's another page from the book where we see Pat talking to Stan Lee, the comic book writer. There's a sense of through the evening how they move from the record player to the middle of the room, and later looks like he's looking at some of her writing, and then even when they're outside, she's in the black thought bubble. She's telling him about her mystery novel, and he's talking about comics. You can see the superheroes and even the screens, those with the little dots, what they use in comics for shading, or in comics in the 1950s they did. She is such a womanizer that even when she's going to therapy to try and stop being a lesbian, she still manages to flirt with her therapist, and then later on she goes to a group therapy where all of these women are trying to stop being gay, and she ends up in bed with one of them. When she goes on a date with a guy, she ends up going home with the woman who is playing piano at the venue. So it was a really well told, engaging story, and I loved seeing background about this famous lesbian novel, The Price of Salt. Next up is a work of comics journalism, 83 Days in Mariupol by Dawn Brown. There's background information at the beginning about some general history about Russia and Ukraine, and then we get right into the brutalities of war with the attack on the port city of Mariupol by the Russians. They were under continual attack from February until May, when the Ukrainian people finally surrendered. But the civilians were targeted, hospitals, water and power. So it was winter, no water, no power, and it was just horrible. The text is minimal, and what Dawn Brown has done is he has used quotes from Mariupol citizens that appeared in news reportage. So all of those sources are linked in the bibliography at the end. Even though it's called a war diary, it's more like a compilation of things people said. It's not one person's diary. Very hard-hitting, very current, and it is suitable for students in high school and anyone who is interested in current events. Now, the last book on my list is also nonfiction. It is an autobiography. It's Lonely at the Center of the Earth, an autobiographic novel by Zoe Thorogood, a British cartoonist. At the Eisner Awards this year, she was nominated in 5 different categories. 3 of the nominations were for her artwork in Rain that she did with Joe Hill, and 2 were for this memoir. And she got the Russ Manning Promising Newcomer Award. Her work is so original, so exciting. I'm going to show you lots of images from her book because it's hard to describe without seeing. Zoe is suicidal, and in this memoir she covers, I think, about 6 months in her life, and she depicts her depression as sort of like a Miyazaki kind of monster, big black monster with a mask, and she has avatars of herself as well, like you can see in this image. Herself at different ages and different mental states of mind, I guess. Sometimes she uses photographs, sometimes various styles of drawing, like you can see in this image here. The text is, "Where does the page end and I begin? Life, stories, characters, a room of mirrors, reflections upon reflections of twisted reality. It doesn't matter who I am. I can be anything on the page." A lot of it has a very highly realistic style, like you can see here. And she will alternate between color panels and black and white panels in a really effective way. And I love the way that she shows how music makes her feel. Well, there was lots of activity around here, a bit of an interruption, but the only thing I had left anyway was to say thank you everybody for watching. Thank you so much. please say hello in the comments below. I always love to hear from you, and I am going to leave you with just a little bit of footage of what artists' studios are like. You have seen me filming in Lori's home studio, but this is the last month that she has space at a larger studio where there's a bunch of other artists as well, and it's hard to believe that great art can come out of some pretty dingy places like you'll see in this footage. Bye for now, and I'll see you all soon.
Lilith Fair and with the spiral from Barcelona.